Voters in Texas can register to vote online for the first time when they're updating or renewing their driver's license. The state's seeing record voter registration with over 1.5 million new people signing up since the last presidential election. More than 16 million people now registered to vote in the state. NBC News reporter Priscilla Thompson joining us now from Houston. Priscilla, online voter registration is a big change, but it's not the only one this year. What else is different this time around?
Allison, that online voter registration is actually a very significant change here. You know, for context, during COVID-19, when DMVs and a lot of those offices were closed, many people were registering and renewing their licenses online. But the problem was they couldn't update their voter registration online. Instead, they would have to print out a form, fill it out, and then turn it into their county registrar. And, you know, if folks didn't have printers at home, that meant trying to find a place to print it out, all to get their voter registration renewed. And it was just last month that a judge ruled that was not in violation of the National Voter Registration Act, and that Texas did need to implement some way for folks who were renewing those licenses, updating those licenses, to register online, which is where we saw this change come from. But it does only impact that small sort of segment of the population who is doing that license renewal. Other folks instead are coming out to voter registration events like the one that I covered today, trying to get that taken care of. But as you mentioned, those are some of the changes on the voter registration side. But there are also going to be changes when folks step into the booth to cast their ballot. I actually spoke with the county clerk a little bit about that earlier today. Take a listen to one of the changes that he described.
Well, not only are we going to have unprecedented turnout, but this is the first election where you can't vote a straight ticket here in Texas. So it's going to take a longer time to vote. And of course, we're voting during the time of COVID-19. And so it's essential that we keep voters safe as they vote at the polls.
And so that idea that voters may need more time in that booth is definitely something that the clerk there has been thinking about in planning out how this election will run. He's told me that they have added additional voting machines. They're doing a lot of the polling in larger locations like the Toyota Center where we are today in order to help people get in and get out without having to wait in those extremely long lines, some of which we saw during the primary on Super Tuesday earlier this year, Allison.
Priscilla, Texas has never seen registration numbers like this before. What do you know about what's behind the surge? What's getting people registered there?
Well, I talked to many voters today who were getting signed up, and the message that I heard from all of them is a need for their voices to be heard in this election. People feel like there is so much going on, and this year in particular, and they want to be a part of that conversation and feel like they have a say in the direction that the country is heading. And one of the interesting things that I want to point out about this record number of voters who are registered in Texas is that this doesn't necessarily serve to benefit Democrats, Republicans, independents. The Houston Chronicle actually did an analysis and found that while about 1/3 of the new registrants are popping up in counties that are Democratic strongholds, so places with large cities like Austin, Houston, and San Antonio, they're also seeing a surge in those suburban areas that Donald Trump won in 2016. So the real impact of all of these new voters is not going to be known until Election Day. And the other thing is that, you know, these folks have to actually come out and vote. They have registered, but now these organizations are shifting to making sure these folks are going to turn out to the ballot box during early voting and on Election Day. Allison?
All right, Priscilla Thompson in Houston, thanks so much.
Thanks, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.